Mount Hood had always seemed welcoming. Nate and I had visited before, short day trips mostly, a quick drive from Eugene when we needed a change of scenery. But we'd never ventured into its deeper reaches, the isolated corners away from tourists and marked trails. When we found a posting online advertising a rustic, secluded cabin, off-grid, miles from the nearest neighbor, it sounded like the ideal escape. The ad was sparse, the price affordable, and we didn't ask too many questions. The owner, whoever he was, assured us via email that we'd find everything we needed inside. His last message warned that cell signals died out past rhododendron, which sounded like paradise at the time. No buzzing phones, no endless notifications, just the quiet solitude we'd been craving. We drove past government camp, turned onto a dirt road marked only by a faded wooden sign, and followed the overgrown path as branches brushed against our windows. After nearly an hour, the road became too narrow, and Nate parked the car by a stand of old-growth trees. From there, we had to carry our bags the last 50 yards on foot. When we first saw the cabin, my stomach tightened a bit. It was small and sturdy, but rougher than I'd imagined. Heavy pine logs formed the walls, moss creeping up from the damp earth. A rusted manual water pump stood in front, and the windows were filmed with years of grime. Nate flashed me a reassuring grin, squeezed my shoulder gently, and stepped up onto the porch, keys jingling in his hand. The air inside smelled earthy and musty, but the place was solid enough. Wooden furniture, heavy blankets, an old wood-burning stove. It felt like stepping back into another era. On a battered wooden table lay a leather-bound guest book, warped from humidity and speckled with mold. I flipped through its yellowed pages. The most recent entry was dated July 1991. "Enjoy your stay," it read. Nothing since. "Charming," Nate laughed uneasily. "Let's get some air." We spent that first evening on the porch. Nate built a fire in a stone ring just outside the cabin, and soon the comforting scent of burning pine drifted around us. It felt peaceful as we settled into folding chairs, drinking wine and listening to the occasional distant owl or snap of a twig somewhere deep in the woods. As the sun set, the forest took on a shadowed twilight blue hue. The silence stretched deeper. I don't remember who noticed first. It might have been Nate suddenly sitting upright, or the way he lowered his wineglass slowly, eyes fixed toward the trees at the edge of the clearing. "What is it?" I asked, squinting in the dimming light. "Someone's out there," he murmured. I followed his gaze. A chill ran through me, immediate and sharp. Just beyond the edge of the tree line, standing perfectly still, was a figure. Too far away to make out clearly, but undeniably there. It didn't move, didn't shift even slightly. It was just standing, watching. "Maybe it's another hiker," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But something deep inside me rejected that idea immediately. We waved cautiously. There was no response, just silence and stillness. Nate grabbed his flashlight, switched it on, and aimed it toward the trees. My breath caught as the beam illuminated empty space. The figure was gone, as if erased from existence. We exchanged uneasy glances. Neither of us spoke, but the comforting isolation we'd sought suddenly felt oppressive, heavy with dread. Nate stoked the fire higher, sending sparks swirling into the night sky. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the trees, jolted me awake. Nate's steady breathing beside me was my only comfort as I drifted in and out, wondering if we'd made a terrible mistake. By morning, daylight brought some reassurance. Coffee brewed over the stove, and we tried to laugh away the unease of the night before. Nate walked down toward the spot where we'd seen the figure, expecting footprints or evidence of someone having stood there. He returned, shaking his head. "No tracks," he said quietly. "Nothing at all." The rational part of me clung to logic. It had been dusk. Shadows could play tricks. Maybe it had been a deer, standing strangely upright. But the memory was vivid, stubbornly clear. We spent the morning hiking short distances around the property, trying to put distance between ourselves and the unsettling feeling from the night before. On our return, we noticed something odd. A length of rusted wire nailed crudely into a tree, a relic from another time marking an abandoned boundary. But it led nowhere, just disappeared into the underbrush. We didn't speak of it, though I noticed Nate glancing back at it several times as we walked on. As twilight approached again, anxiety prickled at my skin. We decided to build the fire earlier, hoping its presence would keep whatever we'd seen at bay. But as shadows lengthened once more, there it was again. Closer this time, maybe 70 yards away, standing, motionless, waiting just beyond the reach of our sight. Nate grabbed his binoculars. I watched his face as he scanned slowly, his expression darkening. He handed them to me without a word. My hands trembled as I raised them to my eyes, adjusting the focus until the figure sharpened into view. It was shadowed, nearly featureless, but something about it was wrong. Its posture too rigid, clothing dark, like old fatigues or a ranger uniform worn and tattered. "What do we do?" I whispered. Nate didn't respond at first. He only reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly, refusing to break his gaze. "I don't know," he finally said quietly, "but we're not alone out here." We decided at sunrise. It was time to leave. Neither Nate nor I had slept much, haunted by the memory of that figure standing at the edge of the trees. Whatever this was, it wasn't the peaceful retreat we'd envisioned. With daylight filtering weakly through the thick forest canopy, I hurriedly packed our bags, while Nate carried our belongings out to the car. We spoke very little, our tension palpable. I stepped onto the porch and my eyes immediately fixed on Nate. He was hunched over the open hood of our car, hands moving rapidly. Something was wrong. I could feel it. Approaching cautiously, I called out, "What's going on?" He looked up at me, face pale beneath a thin sheen of sweat. "The battery's dead." "Dead? How? It was fine 2 days ago." He shook his head grimly. "It wasn't an accident. The terminal's unscrewed. Someone messed with it, Becca." A wave of dread washed over me. This was deliberate. Someone didn't want us leaving. Nate tried to reconnect the battery, but it was too far drained. We were stuck, stranded without cell service, miles from anyone who might hear us. "We'll hike out," Nate said, doing his best to sound confident. "If we follow the road back, eventually we'll hit the main route." I nodded, though the prospect was unsettling, but staying here felt worse. Within minutes, we were moving down the narrow dirt road, silent except for our steady breathing and the crunch of our shoes on gravel. After a mile or so, Nate slowed abruptly. "Becca, look!" He pointed to something odd, a small, precise pile of pine needles. They were fresh, stacked neatly, clearly deliberate. We walked further, finding more piles at equal distances, perfectly spaced every 50 feet or so. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had marked this trail recently, methodically. "What do you think it means?" I whispered, scanning the trees nervously. "I don't know," Nate admitted, "but I don't think it's good." We pushed forward cautiously, our pace quickening despite fatigue. After another 20 minutes, Nate stopped again, breath sharply drawn. Ahead, nailed to a massive fir tree, was an old weathered wooden sign. In faded letters it read, "Do not trespass. Property of the U.S. Forest Service, Site 17A." Site 17A? Have you ever heard of that? Nate shook his head. "It's not on any map I've ever seen." We stood there for several minutes, frozen, unsure how to proceed. The forest around us felt oppressive, the trees towering overhead like silent witnesses. Eventually, Nate turned toward me, concern etched deeply into his face. "I think we should head back. We don't know what's out there." The idea of returning made my chest tighten painfully, but the uncertainty ahead was equally terrifying. Reluctantly, I agreed, and we retraced our steps toward the cabin. Neither of us spoke much as the forest closed in again, each of us alert to every rustle, every distant sound. Back at the cabin, as daylight waned, the oppressive tension settled around us like fog. We locked the door and double-checked the windows, though the flimsy latches offered little comfort. Nate began stacking furniture in front of the door, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. I kept glancing through the window, afraid yet compelled to look. Sure enough, as dusk crept in, the figure had returned. My heart clenched painfully as I realized it was now halfway across the meadow, closer than ever, silent and utterly still. "Nate," I whispered urgently, "it's closer." He rushed to the window, his breath catching sharply. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling the curtains shut. "This isn't right. None of it." We sat on the old couch together, bodies tense, ears straining against the silence. Every creak, Every faint tap against the wall seemed amplified, and I wondered desperately who, or what, was out there, circling us, drawing closer with each passing hour. Late into the night, exhaustion blurred the edges of my fear. My eyes grew heavy, and I nearly drifted off when suddenly a scratching sound jolted me awake. Nate tensed beside me, hand gripping my arm. The scratching became a slow drag, wood against wood, something placed deliberately against the outer wall. What was that? My voice shook, barely audible. Nate stood slowly, eyes wide with alarm, and peered out the side window. He froze, rigid and silent, staring down at the ground. I joined him, heart hammering. In the dim moonlight, just visible against the dirt beneath the window, were fresh footprints pressed deep into the earth, heels digging in, leading away from the cabin. On the windowsill, wedged deliberately into the gap, was an old rusted Forest Service badge. Nate reached out cautiously, plucking it free. The metal was cold, corroded by years of exposure, yet unmistakably official. My hands trembled as he passed it to me. Someone had placed it there deliberately, a message, or maybe a threat. Neither of us slept after that. We sat together silently, staring at the locked door, waiting anxiously for dawn. I clutched the badge in my hand, the corroded metal digging painfully into my palm. It felt like a warning, but worse. It felt like a promise that whatever waited in the dark wasn't finished yet. The first hints of dawn were enough. Nate and I silently agreed. We couldn't stay trapped here another night. We packed quickly, leaving anything unnecessary behind. Nate pocketed the rusted Forest Service badge, the grim reminder from the night before, as we stepped out into the still, gray morning. The forest around us lay hushed and heavy. There was no visible sign of whoever had been tormenting us, but the presence felt closer now, more tangible, as though eyes were watching our every movement. Nate shouldered our backpack, grabbing my hand tightly as we stepped off the porch, refusing to look back at the cabin looming silently behind us. We walked at a swift pace along the rough dirt road, our breathing shallow, eyes scanning the trees with hypervigilance. The silence unnerved me more than any sound could have. It felt unnatural, a void where life should have thrived. Nate kept glancing over his shoulder, and soon I found myself doing the same, the fear building steadily with each step. After half an hour, a faint snapping noise came from somewhere behind us. I froze mid-step, Nate squeezing my hand tightly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded slowly. Then came another sound, quieter, rhythmic, the soft crunch of footsteps, matching ours, somewhere out of sight. Each time we stopped, the noise ceased. Each time we moved, it resumed, perfectly synchronized. My chest tightened with panic. "We need to go faster," Nate said urgently, and we started running, ignoring the branches tearing at our arms and faces. Our pace quickened until we were sprinting blindly down the trail, propelled by pure fear and desperation. My lungs burned, throat dry and raw. Nate's grip never loosened. Hours blurred together in frantic flight until finally, exhaustion forced us to slow. We stopped in a small clearing, breathless, scanning frantically around us. Nothing stirred, no visible threat, only the unsettling quiet pressing down on us from every direction. Just as panic began creeping back, distant headlights flickered through the trees, bobbing gently as a vehicle moved along the main road ahead. Nate's eyes widened, flooded with relief. "Becca, come on!" We ran again, stumbling through the brush, calling out as loudly as we could. The vehicle slowed and pulled over. White, official-looking, emblazoned with a Forest Service logo. My knees nearly buckled with relief as we approached. The ranger stepped from the driver's side, an older man with weathered skin and wary eyes. He regarded us with an unreadable expression, concern deepening the lines on his face. "You two lost?" "No, yes," Nate stammered. "We rented a cabin back there off Lolo Pass Road. Something happened. Someone was following us." The ranger stared, suddenly rigid. "Cabin off Lolo Pass Road?" "Yes," I replied quickly. "It was rustic, small, no electricity. We booked it online." His eyes narrowed slightly and he glanced briefly toward the direction we'd come. "You'd better get in." We climbed into the warmth of the truck's cab, the relief overwhelming. He introduced himself as Ranger Hank Redden, his voice calm but guarded. We recounted everything: the figure at the edge of the trees, the sabotaged car, the badge left in the window. Ranger Redden listened in silence, his expression becoming increasingly grim. When we finished, he sighed deeply and shook his head. That cabin isn't rented, hasn't been for decades. It was officially condemned in '92 after an incident. What kind of incident? Nate's voice cracked slightly. Redden hesitated briefly, then reached into a compartment between the seats and produced a weathered binder. A murder-suicide. Ranger Mitchell Jenkins. He shot 2 people, a couple squatting illegally, then himself. Authorities sealed it off, declared it abandoned. He flipped open the binder. My breath caught sharply as my eyes landed on a grainy black and white photograph of a man in a tattered ranger uniform. Though faded and aged, the image was unmistakable. The stiff posture, the dark uniform, exactly like the figure we'd seen standing at the timberline. "That's him," Nate whispered hoarsely. "That's exactly what we saw." Ranger Redden closed the binder gently, expression grave. "You're lucky to have made it out at all." He drove us to a small ranger station near Zigzag. We made a formal report, hands trembling as we recounted the events. The other rangers promised they'd investigate, but their skeptical glances told me they weren't convinced. Days later, safe at home in Eugene, sleep still elusive, my phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. My fingers shook as I tapped the screen, eyes widening in horror at what appeared. A grainy, shadowed photo of Nate and me, taken through the cabin window. My pulse thundered in my ears. Below the photo, a single line of text. "Nice to finally see you up close." My breath halted. I stared helplessly at Nate, knowing we'd never truly escaped what waited for us in those woods. It's been 6 months since we lost David. 6 months of a silence between my sister Chloe and me that felt heavier and more suffocating than any grief I could process. He was the glue, the vibrant, laughing bridge between my pragmatism and her artistic chaos. With him gone, we were just 2 strangers sharing a history of inside jokes that no longer felt funny. That's why I booked the cabin. I thought the Ozark National Forest, with its rugged, honest wilderness, could be the neutral territory where we might find our way back to each other. I thought the quiet would be healing. I was wrong. The last few miles to the cabin were a testament to the word secluded. My sedan bounced and rattled over a winding dirt road, the color of rust, that seemed to burrow deeper into the earth with every turn. Towering oaks and hickories formed a dense canopy overhead, swallowing the late afternoon sun and plunging us into a humid, green twilight. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my architect's mind cataloging the remoteness, the sheer distance from anything resembling civilization. "Are we there yet?" Chloe's voice was flat, devoid of its usual melodic lilt. She hadn't looked up from her sketchbook since we'd left the main highway. "Almost," I said, trying to inject some cheer into my tone. The owner said to look for a hand-carved sign, "Stillwater." The cabin, when we finally found it, sat in a small, lumpy clearing. It was smaller than the pictures had suggested, built from massive, dark logs that looked ancient. The gaps chinked with a gray, crumbling mortar. It had the presence of something that had grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. My first thought was of structural integrity. Chloe's, I'm sure, was of its rustic charm. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. A single large room served as living, dining, and sleeping space, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was sturdy, handmade, and worn smooth with time. "Well, it's authentic," I said, running a hand over the rough-hewn mantel. Chloe finally looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes, the same deep brown as David's, scanning the room. "It's perfect," she whispered, a ghost of her old smile touching her lips. The first day was a fragile truce. We tackled a 5-mile loop of the Ozark Highlands Trail, the strenuous climb leaving us little breath for forced conversation. The air was thick and hot, but the view from the top, a sweeping panorama of rolling green mountains stretching to the horizon, was worth it. We ate our sandwiches in near silence, but it was a comfortable silence for the first time in months. I caught Chloe looking at a hawk circling on the thermals, a genuine spark of interest in her eyes. It was a start. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the tree line, the world went quiet. It wasn't the gradual, layered hush of a normal forest night. It was abrupt, like a switch had been flipped. One moment, the air was filled with the chittering of insects and the droning of cicadas. The next, there was nothing. A profound, unnatural silence pressed in on the cabin from all sides. "Do you hear that?" Chloe asked, her voice a little too loud in the stillness. "Hear what? There's nothing to hear," I said, trying to sound dismissive. But she was right. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was an absence, a void where sound should have been. The second night, the silence returned, heavier and more complete. We sat on the porch, nursing cups of lukewarm tea, the quiet stretching our nerves taut. Then, a new sound started, a slow, rhythmic scrape. Scrape. Scrape coming from the edge of the woods. It was the sound of rock grinding on rock, deliberate and methodical. "What is that?" Chloe whispered, her eyes wide. "A deer, maybe, rubbing its antlers on a rock," I offered, my own heart beginning to beat a little faster. But the sound wasn't right. It was too heavy, too consistent. It continued for nearly an hour, seeming to move parallel to our clearing, before it finally faded away. We went to bed that night with the flimsy cabin door locked, a chair wedged under the knob for good measure. I told myself we were being ridiculous. The next day, a pervasive feeling of being watched followed us on our hike. We cut it short, the beauty of the forest now feeling menacing. That evening, the scraping started earlier, louder, and unmistakably closer. It was coming from the spot where the woods were darkest, where the trail we'd hiked earlier disappeared into shadow. "I'm going to see what it is," I said, my voice betraying a confidence I didn't feel. "Maya, no!" Chloe grabbed my arm. "We have to know," I insisted, pulling away. Grabbing the heavy-duty flashlight from my pack, I marched towards the edge of the clearing, Chloe trailing hesitantly behind me. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the tree line, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. Then I pointed it at the ground. My breath caught in my throat. There, in the hard-packed, damp earth at the edge of the forest, were two deep parallel gouges. They were about a foot apart and dug several inches into the soil and the exposed limestone beneath it. They looked as if something impossibly heavy, with two stone-like points, had dragged itself out of the woods and then back in again. The displaced dirt was still dark and moist. They were fresh. Chloe let out a small, choked gasp. We stood there for a long moment, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand, the only sound the frantic thumping of my own heart. The rational explanations, a fallen tree, some kind of farm equipment, anything, died in my mind. There was nothing rational about the marks in the ground, and in the heavy, pressing silence of the Ozark night, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever had made them was still out there, in the dark, and it was coming for us. We scrambled back into the cabin, slamming the door and fumbling with the deadbolt. The chair I had wedged under the knob last night now seemed like a child's toy. We didn't speak. There were no words for what we had seen. The silence that had been our companion for 2 nights was now our enemy, a canvas against which every terrifying possibility could be painted. And then the scraping started again. Not from the edge of the woods this time. It was in the clearing. It was slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Each scrape was a drawn-out, grating sound that vibrated through the floorboards and up my spine. My mind, usually a safe harbor of logic and reason, was a storm of raw fear. I thought of the gouges in the earth, the sheer weight required to carve into solid rock. Scrape. Scrape. It was at the porch steps now. The wood creaked under a pressure it was never designed to bear. Chloe had backed into the farthest corner of the room, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide and dark. Tears streamed down her face, silent and constant. Scrape. It was on the porch. The sound was deafeningly close, a heavy dragging weight. Then, a new sound, a low, grinding noise, like stone rubbing against the logs of the cabin wall, right next to the boarded-up window. Curiosity, or maybe some desperate need to understand the source of our terror, propelled me forward. I crept to the window, my body trembling. I peered through a small, grimy pane of glass between 2 of the thick wooden slats. What I saw wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything I had a name for. A hulking, vaguely humanoid shape blotted out the faint moonlight. Its body was a lumpy, asymmetrical mass of what looked like wet river rocks, dark moss, and thick, gnarled roots, all fused together. It had no face, no eyes, no features at all. It was just a thing of stone and earth, animated by some unknowable force. Two long, heavy limbs ended in jagged points of rock, the source of the gouges. It was methodically dragging one of them against the wall, testing its strength with a slow, relentless pressure. A deep, primal part of my brain screamed, but I couldn't make a sound. "Maya, what is it?" Chloe's voice was a ragged whisper. I couldn't answer. I just backed away from the window, shaking my head. The image was burned into my mind. The sight of it, the sheer wrongness of it, broke something in me. For a moment, all I could see was David, falling, the rope snapping, my own hand reaching out, grasping at empty air. I had failed to save him. I would not fail to save Chloe. That single thought cut through the fog of my fear. The creature moved to the front of the cabin. A tremendous grinding pressure was applied to the door. It wasn't the frantic attack of a bear. It was slow, methodical, and patient. The thick oak of the door began to groan, the wood fibers screaming in protest. Splinters of wood rained down from the door frame. Dust trickled from the ceiling. We were in a box, and something was trying to patiently pry it open. Chloe let out a sob, a raw sound of pure terror. "We're going to die here." "No, we're not," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "Think, Chloe, think." "I can't!" she cried, her body racked with shudders. Then her eyes went wide with something other than fear, a memory. "The map," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at my backpack. "The map. There was an old trail, a logging trail. It went to a fire tower. A metal structure, high off the ground. A chance." I scrambled for the pack, my hands clumsy as I unzipped it and pulled out the crumpled map. While the creature's attention was focused on its slow, grinding assault on the front door, I spread the map on the floor. In the dim light we found it, a thin, dotted line labeled Old Logging Ard, branching off the main trail a half-mile back and snaking for several miles before ending at a small symbol marked FT. Hope, as sharp and painful as a needle, pierced through my fear. "The back window," I whispered, pointing to the small square window above the kitchen sink. The creature at the door gave a tremendous shove, and a loud crack echoed through the cabin. We didn't have much time. While the grinding and splintering at the front of the cabin covered our movements, we worked on the window. It was swollen shut with decades of humidity. We put our shoulders into it, grunting with effort. For a terrifying moment, it wouldn't budge. Then with a shriek of protesting wood, it gave way, swinging open into the night. I hoisted Chloe up. "Go, don't look back, just run for the trail." She scrambled through, dropping to the soft ground outside. I followed, landing awkwardly on my ankle. A sharp pain shot up my leg, but I ignored it. We didn't dare look back. Behind us, the sound of the front door beginning to splinter and break apart was all the motivation we needed. We ran. We crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, the oppressive silence of the forest returning now that the scraping had ceased. The only sounds were our own ragged breaths and the frantic pounding of our feet on the damp earth. The moon was a sliver, offering little light to guide us. Every shadow was a monster, every rustle of leaves a new threat. The image of the rock and moss thing, faceless and relentless, propelled us onward, our fear a cold, hard knot in my stomach. We ran blindly, desperately into the suffocating darkness of the woods. My lungs were on fire. Every breath was a ragged, tearing gasp that did nothing to quell the burning in my chest. Pain, sharp and insistent, radiated up from my ankle with every jarring step. Beside me, Chloe ran with a wild, desperate energy, her face pale and streaked with dirt in the faint moonlight. The woods were a disorienting maze of black trunks and grasping branches. We ran without direction, propelled only by the memory of splintering wood and the image of that faceless, rock-hewn thing. Just when I thought my legs would give out, that I would collapse right there on the forest floor, my foot caught on something, not a root, but a rut. I stumbled and fell, my bad ankle twisting beneath me. I cried out, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the immense silence. "Maya!" Chloe was at my side, hauling me up. "I'm okay," I gasped, though my vision swam with pain. I looked down. It wasn't just one rut, it was two faint, parallel depressions in the earth, mostly overgrown, but still discernible. It was a path. The old logging trail. Hope, thin and fragile, flickered within me. We had found it. We followed the faint trail, half running, half stumbling. It was a grueling, endless journey through the dark. The silence pressed in, a physical weight. I found myself listening, straining to hear the scrape of rock on rock behind us. But there was nothing. Only the sound of our own labored breathing and the crunch of our feet on the forest debris. The absence of pursuit was almost as terrifying as the pursuit itself. Where had it gone? The sky ahead began to soften from impenetrable black to a deep, bruised purple. And then we saw it. As we crested a small rise, a silhouette emerged against the lightening sky. It was a stark, skeletal structure of metal crossbeams and struts, pointing a finger at the heavens. The fire tower. The sight broke through our exhaustion. We summoned a final, desperate burst of energy, scrambling up the steep incline toward its base. The tower was old, rusted, and forgotten. A chain-link fence surrounded it, but a section had long ago collapsed. We squeezed through and ran to the base of the metal staircase that spiraled up into the sky. The climb was terrifying in its own right. The metal steps groaned and creaked under our weight, slick with dew. With every upward step, I expected a rung to give way, sending us plummeting back into the darkness. We didn't stop, didn't look down, until we reached the small glass-paned cab at the very top. I shoved the door open, and we collapsed inside, huddling together on the floor, our bodies shaking uncontrollably. From our vantage point, we watched the sun rise. It was the most beautiful and welcome sight of my life. Ribbons of orange and pink unfurled across the horizon, pushing back the shadows and illuminating the vast, rolling sea of the Ozark National Forest. And with the light came sound. First, a single bird chirped, then another joined in. Soon the air was filled with a chorus of birdsong, the rustle of wind through the canopy, the hum of insects, the normal, natural sounds of the world reasserting themselves. The unnatural silence was broken. We were safe. We stayed in the tower until the sun was high in the sky, its full light a comforting blanket. We made the difficult choice. The car, our phones, my laptop, Chloe's art supplies, all of it would be left behind. They were just things. We could not bring ourselves to hike back to the cabin. The walk out, following the logging trail to where it eventually met a gravel service road, was a long, nerve-wracking ordeal. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking shape. Every snap of a twig made us jump. It took hours before we finally saw a plume of dust from an approaching truck, an old Ford driven by a park ranger. He saw our torn clothes, our scratched faces, and our exhaustion, and listened with a patient, practiced skepticism. We told him we got lost, that a bear had torn apart our cabin. It was easier than trying to explain the truth. He nodded, his expression giving nothing away, and drove us back to the nearest town. We filed a report with the local sheriff, who promised to send someone to check on the cabin. We never heard from them again. We took a bus back to the city, leaving that entire chapter of our lives behind in the Arkansas woods. Months have passed. Chloe and I talk now. We talk about everything, except that night. The shared terror forged a bond between us that grief had nearly shattered. She's sculpting again, not with wood and stone, but with welded metal, creating things of stark, angular beauty. I'm designing buildings again, finding comfort in the solid, predictable laws of physics. We are survivors. That is our satisfying ending. But sometimes in the quiet moments, when I'm alone in my apartment and the city outside has fallen into a momentary hush, I can still feel it. That profound, unnatural stillness. And I remember the slow, rhythmic scrape of rock on rock, and the faceless, silent thing that lurks in the deep woods, waiting in the stillness of the Ozarks. We know what we saw, and we know that we were lucky to escape with only our memories. Porcupine Mountains Wilderness. State Park covers more than 60,000 acres of dense forest in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Most visitors come for the rugged beauty, waterfalls, scenic overlooks, endless trails winding through hardwood forests. By late October, though, the park is mostly abandoned. The air turns brittle, the colors drain from the leaves, and visitors thin out dramatically. The park rangers warn hikers at the visitor center that going far into the backcountry at this time of year isn't recommended unless you're experienced. But Jake booked Mirror Lake Cabin 4 anyway, a remote log cabin 7 miles deep into the wilderness, with no electricity, no running water, and definitely no cell service. I wasn't worried. I'd been hiking all my life, though never quite this far out, or this late in the season. Jake was always laid back, always optimistic. Evan, on the other hand, needed this trip more than any of us. He was fresh off a divorce, quiet on the ride up from Chicago, just staring out the window, occasionally checking his phone as if he still expected messages that would never come. We arrived at the visitor center around noon, and a ranger named Patel handed us our maps. He looked us over carefully, noting Evan's designer jeans and Jake's old Converse sneakers. I felt judged in my fleece jacket and expensive boots. Like Patel could tell we weren't the usual hardened hikers who pushed into these parts in late October. "Just make sure you get there well before dark," Patel said, tracing a finger over the map toward our cabin. "And don't wander too far off trail. Easy to lose your bearings out there." The hike took us longer than expected. 7 miles doesn't seem like much until you're carrying all your gear on your back. The trail twisted sharply through tall, slender trees, their branches nearly bare. A carpet of wet leaves made footing slippery. Evan struggled, frequently stopping to catch his breath, though I suspected he just wanted to be alone. Jake made jokes, tried to lighten the mood. I focused on the silence, the unsettling quiet of the forest closing around us. It was late afternoon when the cabin came into view. Built from thick logs, it sat in a small clearing, a stone fire pit out front, the lake glinting like black glass behind it. The cabin was exactly as advertised, rustic, sturdy, isolated. Inside smelled faintly of damp wood and ashes. We unloaded our packs, grateful for the chance to rest. Dinner was canned chili heated over a crackling fire outside. Evan warmed up slightly as the evening wore on, smiling a little more freely, sharing jokes I knew cost him effort. We toasted cheap whiskey from Jake's flask and pretended we weren't as cold as we were. By the time we decided to call it a night, the darkness had pressed firmly around us. It felt tangible, thick enough to swallow sound, heavy enough to smother the firelight quickly once we went inside. Jake climbed the ladder to the loft. Evan chose the cot by the far window, and I took the bunk nearest the stove. Sleep came quickly at first, fueled by fatigue and whiskey. The knocking woke us around midnight, 3 sharp taps, evenly spaced. I sat up immediately, disoriented, heart hammering against my ribs. "Did you hear that?" Evan's voice trembled from across the dark cabin. Jake answered groggily from above. "Hear what?" Another set of 3 taps, clearer this time. Front door. We all scrambled upright, reaching for headlamps. My legs felt leaden, weighted by a primal reluctance to move toward that sound. "Someone might be in trouble," Jake murmured, trying to rationalize the situation. He approached the door slowly, hand extended as if afraid it might open on its own. He pulled it open. Outside there was no one, only the darkness staring back at us, silent and absolute. Evan stepped out cautiously, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the damp ground. "There's footprints," he whispered, voice brittle. I joined him outside, following the pale glow of his flashlight. Bare footprints, stark against the wet, cold mud, encircled the cabin. Not boots or shoes, bare feet, impossibly small. Evan's hand shook visibly, the light trembling over the imprints in the dirt. "Maybe someone playing a prank," Jake suggested, clearly trying to calm us. But even he couldn't mask the unease creeping into his voice. He moved his light toward the tree line, scanning back and forth. No movement, no noise. We retreated inside, quickly locking the door behind us, pulling the wooden shutters closed, shutting out the darkness as best we could. Nobody wanted to talk. Evan sat wide-eyed, rigid on his cot. Jake took the loft again, his silence betraying his nerves. I volunteered to keep watch. They didn't argue. Alone, I sat awake for hours, listening intently. my mind running through explanations that never quite satisfied. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of settling logs pulled me closer to panic. Then, just past 3 in the morning, I heard movement outside. A careful shuffling of feet in the fallen leaves, slow and deliberate. I stood quietly and peered through a narrow gap in the shutter. About 30 yards from the cabin, lit only by the faint light of the moon, stood a figure. Still, silent, watching. I could barely make out details, just the outline, thin, shoulders squared. Human, yet somehow wrong. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, waiting. And so did I. Morning came slowly, the darkness receding inch by inch until a pale gray dawn filled the cabin. Jake climbed down from the loft, eyes bloodshot, moving with a weariness that told me he hadn't slept much either. Evan barely spoke as he stared blankly toward the shuttered windows. None of us brought up the figure I'd seen outside. Some part of me hoped it had been exhaustion playing tricks, but deep down, I knew better. Breakfast was eaten quietly, cold granola bars and instant coffee heated over the wood stove. Nobody wanted to venture out, but we knew we had to survey the area. Jake opened the door first, stepping cautiously onto the porch, looking around nervously before motioning us outside. In the daylight, everything felt safer. The cabin stood innocently amid skeletal trees, their branches stripped bare by autumn winds. But when we stepped off the porch and looked down, any illusion of safety vanished. The footprints from last night circled the cabin in a deliberate pattern, their edges hardened by overnight frost. Smaller sets of tracks appeared now, weaving through the trees, crisscrossing paths. More than one person, Evan whispered, the color draining from his face. Who walks around barefoot out here? Jake tried a weak laugh. Kids, probably. Local kids messing around. But his voice didn't convince any of us, least of all himself. He glanced back toward the cabin, then at the forest beyond, uncertain. Maybe we hike out now. I agreed immediately, but Evan hesitated. We won't get back before dark. 7 miles in daylight took forever, and now we're exhausted. Jake shook his head, frustrated but resigned. Okay, we'll stay one more night, but we leave at first light tomorrow. No delays. We spent the rest of the day close to the cabin, nervous energy driving us to gather firewood, clean out gear, do anything to distract ourselves. Evan was skittish, his eyes darting constantly toward the tree line, jumping at the slightest snap of a twig. At one point I heard footsteps pacing just beyond the shadows, but when I stopped moving to listen carefully, they ceased abruptly. As daylight slipped away, our nerves tightened. We lit the fire early, flames pushing back the dusk as best they could, but the approaching night was relentless. It swallowed the trees, consumed the sky, leaving us huddled inside the cabin once more. Jake locked the door and barred it with a heavy wooden bench. Evan stood silently near the stove, watching intently. It began again around sunset, softly at first, rhythmic knocking against the cabin walls. This time, the knocks came from multiple directions at once, each sound overlapping, growing louder, quicker, until it sounded like dozens of hands tapping all around us. Jake's breath quickened, Evan's fists clenched tightly. "What do they want?" Evan whispered harshly. "Why won't they just say something?" I couldn't answer. Instead, I moved toward one of the small shuttered windows, heart hammering in my chest. With trembling fingers, I eased open a thin crack, peering out into the gloom. The forest was darkening rapidly, the details fading into silhouettes. But I saw them clearly, figures standing motionless at the edge of the clearing. 3 of them, spaced evenly apart, silent and waiting. My blood chilled. "Who is it?" Jake's voice cracked nervously behind me. "Can you see?" "There's 3, I answered quietly, voice barely audible. "They're just standing there." A sudden movement startled me. A muddy palm slapped hard against the window, smearing grime across the glass. Evan yelled sharply, stumbling back. I jerked away, heart slamming against my ribs. "Jesus," Jake muttered, pacing anxiously. "We need to get out of here." Evan, pale and visibly shaken, suddenly turned toward the door. I have to go. I need to use the outhouse." "Wait until morning," I urged. "Please, Evan." "I can't." he whispered, voice strained. He reached for a flashlight and opened the door quickly, stepping outside before either of us could stop him. We watched helplessly as his beam bobbed toward the outhouse, swallowed quickly by darkness. Minutes ticked by painfully slow. 5, then 10. Jake paced restlessly, checking the window repeatedly. "Evan?" he finally shouted into the darkness. Only silence answered. "I'm going out there," Jake insisted. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped hesitantly onto the porch. I stayed at the door, muscles tensed, eyes straining into the shadows. Jake's flashlight swung nervously back and forth as he walked cautiously toward the outhouse. "Evan?" Jake called again, louder now, desperation creeping into his voice. He stopped abruptly, the beam frozen on something beyond the outhouse. "Ryan, footprints. They're fresh." I hurried to his side, following the weak circle of his flashlight. Clear tracks in the mud led away from the outhouse into the trees. Evan's flashlight lay abandoned on the ground, flickering weakly. "No struggle," Jake murmured. "He just walked away?" My skin prickled, goosebumps rising sharply. "Back to the cabin," I urged, tugging Jake's sleeve urgently. "Now." Inside, we barricaded the door again, pushing every piece of furniture available against it. Our breath came fast, short bursts of panic fogging in the cold cabin air. Outside, the knocking resumed, louder now, insistent, urgent taps that echoed from every direction. My chest tightened painfully. Jake sank heavily onto a chair, face buried in shaking hands. I stayed upright, afraid sitting down might let exhaustion overtake me. Then came silence, a deep, unnatural quiet. Just as my breathing began to steady, a single knock shattered the silence, sharp and clear against the front door. Before either of us could move, another knock came immediately from the back wall, purposeful, deliberate. I moved again toward the window, knowing already what I'd see. Through the narrow gap, 3 shadowy shapes stood among the trees, perfectly still, patiently waiting. When dawn finally broke, Jake and I were already packed and waiting by the door. Neither of us had slept. We stood there for a long moment, staring silently at Evan's abandoned pack, still sitting by the cot as though he'd return at any moment. The woods beyond the cabin were quiet, so quiet it felt unnatural after the chaos of the night. "Ready?" Jake whispered, eyes shadowed and hollow. I nodded silently and unbolted the door. Outside, the air was sharply cold, filled with the damp smell of decaying leaves. We stepped cautiously onto the porch, pausing to scan the tree line. Nothing moved. No footprints in the immediate clearing besides ours and the ones left by Evan the night before. Without another word, we started down the trail toward the main path, packs heavy on our backs, our legs stiff with exhaustion and fear. The trail looked unfamiliar, each bend and dip of the path disorienting now. Jake kept his eyes fixed firmly ahead, gripping his compass as if it were a lifeline. "Trail markers are gone," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. I glanced where he pointed, and a sinking dread filled my stomach. The small reflective markers nailed to trees along the trail, which had guided us to the cabin, were nowhere to be seen. Jagged marks on several trunks showed where someone had ripped them away. "We have the compass," I reassured him, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. "We'll be fine if we keep heading east." Minutes slipped into hours as we walked, the forest stretching endlessly around us. My heart rate climbed steadily, adrenaline mixing with exhaustion. Occasionally I glanced behind us, certain that someone, or something, watched us from the shadows. "We should have reached the ridgeline by now," Jake muttered after a while, frustration edging into panic. He checked the compass repeatedly, shaking his head in disbelief. "We've been walking east this whole time." We stopped briefly. Jake dug out his knife, carving a deep X into the bark of a nearby pine. "Just to be sure," he muttered nervously. We continued onward, my breath tight in my chest, my throat raw from breathing the cold air. 15 minutes later, Jake froze, his face drained of color. Ahead of us, barely visible in the dim morning light, was a familiar sight, the tree marked with an X we'd carved earlier. Somehow, impossibly, we'd circled back. Jake's voice cracked, filled with despair. "It's impossible, we didn't turn once." "We go off trail," I said, desperate now. "Straight line east. No trail at all. Eventually we'll hit something. Anything. Jake nodded numbly, his confidence shattered. We plunged off the path into the thicker woods, branches scraping at our jackets, roots snagging our boots. Our pace quickened, becoming frantic as we tore through underbrush, driven by a rising panic that gripped us both. At times, I thought I heard footsteps behind us, snapping twigs, soft whispers of movement just beyond sight. Once, Jake stopped abruptly, turning sharply toward a patch of dense foliage. "Did you see that?" "What?" My voice shook, though I already knew. "A face," Jake whispered hoarsely. "I swear, I saw someone watching us." My blood turned to ice, but I forced myself to keep moving. "Keep going," I urged. "Just keep going." We stumbled forward, ignoring scratches and exhaustion. Hours passed in a blur of panic. Finally, after what felt like forever, we crashed through a dense barrier of trees and onto a narrow gravel road. The relief almost knocked me off my feet. Jake laughed sharply, a single desperate sound. From down the road, the distant hum of an engine approached. A ranger on a four-wheeler appeared, slowing down at the sight of us, disheveled, filthy, eyes wild with fear. He jumped off quickly. "What happened? You two okay?" he asked urgently, radio in hand. "We were at Mirror Lake Cabin 4, I gasped. "Our friend Evan disappeared last night. People were outside the cabin. Someone took him." The ranger's face hardened, nodding solemnly as he listened. He called for backup on his radio before urging us onto his vehicle. Minutes later, another ranger arrived in a truck, and we made the silent journey back toward the cabin. None of us spoke, anxiety thickening the air inside the cab. As we pulled into the clearing near the cabin, dread twisted painfully in my chest. Everything looked unsettlingly normal. No signs of violence, no obvious disturbance. We moved quickly toward the cabin. Evan was nowhere to be seen. Inside, nothing had changed. His gear lay untouched exactly where he'd left it. We checked everywhere, I explained shakily to the ranger. His flashlight was on the ground, tracks heading into the woods, but no struggle, nothing. The ranger's expression darkened. "Let's check around back. Maybe something we missed." We followed him cautiously, stepping carefully behind the cabin and into the woods. About 20 yards from the back door, the ranger stopped abruptly. His voice caught sharply, causing my pulse to spike again. "What the hell is that?" Ahead of us, nestled in a small clearing, stood dozens of strange, crude totems made from sticks and bones. Feathers fluttered gently from string bindings. They were arranged methodically, almost ritualistically. My eyes focused on one particular figure, larger and disturbingly human-shaped, draped with scraps of cloth. "That's Evan's jacket lining," Jake whispered hoarsely. His voice shook badly. I felt sick, my stomach twisting painfully. The ranger's face paled, his hand reflexively reaching for his radio. "Stay here," he instructed us, quickly stepping away to call for more help. Jake sank to the ground, head buried in his hands. I stayed standing, numb, staring at the totems and the scraps of Evan's clothing swaying silently in the cold breeze. In the days that followed, we answered countless questions. Search parties combed every inch of wilderness around Mirror Lake, but no further signs were ever found. Not Evan, not even footprints leading away from the bizarre clearing behind the cabin. Eventually, the cabin and surrounding trails were closed indefinitely. Weeks later, back home in Chicago, my phone buzzed late at night. A call from the ranger's office. A forgotten trail camera had been retrieved near the cabin. The ranger hesitated before speaking, his voice low and strained. "We caught something on camera," he finally said. "3 figures standing outside your cabin the night your friend disappeared." He sent me the photo. 3 pale, emaciated figures stood in a perfect triangle. Barefoot, thin, staring directly at the cabin door. Their faces were expressionless, gaunt, but unmistakably human, yet completely unknown to anyone who had ever hiked in or patrolled those mountains. I stared at the photo for a long time, heart pounding, hands trembling. No one ever saw them again, and Evan never came home. Of all the traditions Dad and I had, the annual fishing trip was the one that mattered most. After Mom died, it became our thing, a silent agreement that for 1 week a year, we'd leave the city behind and just be. Usually that meant driving the beat-up Ford Ranger down to the Russian River ferry, fighting for a spot on the bank with 50 other guys. But this year was different. For my 17th birthday, a sort of last hurrah before senior year swallowed me whole, Dad booked a fly-in cabin on the Upper Kenai. No roads, no people, just us, a log cabin, and one of the most powerful salmon rivers in the world. The flight in on the de Havilland Beaver was incredible, watching the vast wrinkled green of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge spread out below us. The river itself was a slash of impossible turquoise, a color that seemed too vibrant to be real. The pilot set us down on the water as gently as a dragonfly, and there it was, our home for the week. It was a single-room cabin of dark, heavy logs, with a porch that stood on stilts just yards from the rushing water. The air was thick with the clean, sharp scent of spruce and the wet smell of damp earth. It was perfect. The first day was the kind of day they print on calendars. We stood waist-deep in the shockingly cold current, the water a constant, powerful pressure against our waders. Dad, a man whose patience was forged in his 20 years in the army, showed me again how to read the seams in the current where the sockeye rested. We were good, or maybe just lucky. We caught our limit, their silver and red bodies fighting us with a strength that vibrated right up the line into my bones. That night, we sat in the warm, enclosed space of the cabin, the hiss and crackle of salmon fillets in the cast-iron skillet on the wood stove the only sound. Dad had a small flask of whiskey, and he let me have a sip. The burn of it, mixed with the taste of the fish and the utter peace of the place, felt like a memory I'd want to keep forever. As we settled into our bunks, the fire burning down to a soft orange glow, a change occurred outside. Fog, born from the river's icy temperature, began to fill the space between the trees, a solid wall of white that pressed in from the riverbank and swallowed the landscape. It muffled the world, reducing the constant rush of the water to a distant low hum. I was on the edge of sleep when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was a faint, distinct sound against the cabin wall, the one facing the river. My first thought was a branch. A Sitka spruce stood near that side, and I figured a breeze must be knocking a limb against the logs. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep, but the sound was too measured, too rhythmic. It wasn't the random scrape of wood, it was a steady, deliberate beat. I sat up. In the dim light from the stove's embers, I could see the outline of my father. He was already awake, his head cocked, absolutely still. He wasn't looking at the wall, he was listening to it. "You hear that?" he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "Yeah, just a branch, right?" The question sounded weak even to me. He didn't answer. He slipped out of his bunk, his movements silent and economical, a habit from his old life that never faded. He lifted the heavy iron latch on the door and pulled it open just a crack. A swirl of cold, damp air invaded the cabin. I saw nothing but a uniform, impenetrable whiteness. The air outside was completely still, no wind. The tapping stopped the instant the door opened. Dad stood there for a full minute before closing the door and latching it, his face unreadable in the dark. The next 2 nights were the same. The fog would roll in, and the tapping would begin, intermittent and unnerving. We never found a single mark on the cabin, not a footprint in the soft earth. On our 4th day, we decided to fish a wide gravel bar about a quarter-mile downriver from the cabin. The fishing was slow, and I let my line drift into a deeper channel. It snagged. I sighed, thinking I'd lost another fly to a submerged log. I waded out carefully, the current pulling at my legs, and reached down into the icy water. My fingers closed around something hard and rough. It wasn't a branch. I pulled it up. It was a fishing lure, but unlike anything I had ever seen or read about. The body was a 5-inch piece of yellowed, porous bone, carved into a crude fish shape. The line wasn't monofilament, it was a thick, braided cord of what looked like dried animal sinew. But the hook was what made my stomach clench. It was a shard of black stone, maybe obsidian, flaked to a viciously sharp point, and lashed to the bone with more of the gut-like cord. It was heavy, brutally primitive, and lethally effective. "Dad," I said, my voice tight. He waded over and I held it out. He took it from me, turning it over in his hand. He ran his thumb near the obsidian point. a look of deep-seated revulsion on his face. He'd spent his life around tools, weapons, and gear. He knew craftsmanship. This was that, but it was also something else, something wrong. "Leave it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He dropped it onto the gravel bar as if it were contaminated. "Just leave it here." That evening, the fog came for us before the sun had even set. It was a living entity of white, so thick it felt like we were at the bottom of a bowl of milk. We stood on the porch, a nervous energy crackling between us, and watched the river vanish. And then we saw him. He was just there, standing waist-deep in the middle of the river, a place where the current was so fast it should have torn a man from his feet. His form was a tall, skeletal silhouette against the slightly paler fog behind him. He was gaunt, his limbs unnaturally long and thin. He made no sound. He simply stood in the rushing turquoise water, a statue of bone and shadow. As we stared, our breath caught in our throats. He raised one of his long, spindly arms. There was a flicker of motion at his wrist, a movement too quick to follow, and something, a line, the same color as the sinew on the lure, shot out with a faint whistle. It moved with an impossible, flat trajectory, striking the water 20 yards away, and instantly pulling back, a large, struggling salmon impaled on its end. He had the fish, but he didn't move to secure it. Instead, his head, a dark and oblong shape atop a pencil-thin neck, turned slowly. It rotated with a horrifying smoothness, independent of his body, until it was facing directly at us on the porch. We could see no eyes, no mouth, no face at all. There was only the black shape and the suffocating certainty that we were being seen, measured, and judged by an intelligence that had nothing to do with the world of men. We were no longer fishermen on a trip. We were trespassers, and we had just been noticed. The world narrowed to 2 points: the dark oblong shape in the mist, and the cold, paralyzing certainty that it was looking at me. Time stretched, the roar of the river fading to a hum. Then the shape turned its head away with that same unnatural smoothness and dissolved back into the fog, leaving only the roiling white and the memory of its presence. The spell broke. A violent shiver racked my body, a physical reaction I couldn't control. My breath came in shallow, useless gasps. I looked at Dad. He was already moving, his face a mask of cold granite. The fisherman, the vacationing father, was gone. In his place was the soldier I'd only ever heard stories about. "Mark," he said, his voice so calm it was scarier than if he'd yelled. "Go inside. Pack your day pack. Water filter, fire starter, emergency rations, compass. Nothing else. Leave your rod. Move." "What was that?" I stammered, my voice cracking. "Dad, what was that thing?" "Don't know," he said, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the cabin door. His grip was like iron. "And we're not staying to find out. The plane isn't coming for us. We're on our own." Inside, we moved with frantic purpose. I fumbled with my pack, my fingers clumsy and shaking as I stuffed the survival essentials inside. Dad was already at the door, sliding the heavy wooden bar into its thick iron brackets. The solid thump of the bar seating offered zero comfort. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a trap. As total darkness fell outside, the sound began again. It was different this time. Not a tap, but a hard, solid rap, like someone striking the logs with a heavy stone. It started on the front door, 3 quick concussive blows that vibrated through the floor. Then, impossibly, a rap on the back wall, then the roof, moving with a speed that defied logic. A new sound joined the assault, a noise that came from the direction of the river. It was a low, guttural clicking, a rapid succession of hard sounds, like 100 pebbles being knocked together underwater. The sound seemed to soak through the log walls, a dry, chittering threat that was somehow worse than the rapping. Then came the scrape. A long, loud scrape dragged down the thick planks of the door. I stared in horror as the heavy wooden bar securing us inside began to tremble in its brackets. The wood around the latch groaned, splintering under a focused, immense pressure from the other side. It was going to break. The door was going to fly open. "Get back," Dad ordered, his voice sharp. He grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, holding it like a weapon. He didn't look at the door. He looked at the small window on the back wall, the one facing the dense black woods. It wants us to watch the door." He wrapped his left hand in a thick wool blanket from his bunk, took 2 steps, and drove his fist through the window pane. The glass shattered with a deafening crash. He worked quickly, knocking the remaining shards from the frame, oblivious to the cold air and fog that now poured into the cabin. "Out! Go now, Mark. Be quiet." I scrambled toward the opening, my pack snagging for a second on the splintered frame. I tumbled through, landing hard on the cold, damp earth. The sounds of the assault on the door were suddenly clearer out here. Dad came through right behind me, landing in a low crouch, the black skillet still in his hand. We were out of the trap and into the cage of the wilderness. He didn't hesitate. "This way," he hissed, grabbing my sleeve. He pulled out his compass, gave it a 1-second glance in the faint, ambient light that filtered through the fog, and plunged into the trees. He set a course upriver, but deep in the forest, keeping the sound of the water to our left as a guide. The next hours were a nightmare of motion and misery. We didn't run. The forest floor was too treacherous. It was a high-stepping, stumbling flight through a black maze. Wet branches of alder whipped at our faces. The needle-like thorns of Devil's Club tore at our clothes and skin. Moss-covered logs lay hidden in the fog, and my ankles twisted more than once on unseen roots. Every sound I made, a snapped twig, a gasping breath, felt like a beacon in the night. We heard no footsteps behind us. The pursuit was entirely auditory, and it came from the river. To our left, a powerful rhythmic splashing kept pace with us. It was the sound of something large moving through the water with tireless ease. Sometimes it would stop, and the silence would scream at us. We'd freeze, listening, until the splashing resumed, occasionally seeming closer than before. The guttural clicking echoed through the mist, a constant hunting sound that made the hairs on my arms stand up. We were being herded, stalked by something that owned the night and the water, while we were 2 blind mice scrambling in the dark. After what felt like an eternity, we broke through a thicket of brush into a small, boggy clearing. The splashing from the river stopped. The sudden total silence was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. Dad grabbed the back of my jacket and pulled me down behind a massive fallen spruce tree. We crouched in the wet moss, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure it was audible. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes wide and scanning the darkness. We listened. From the riverbank, maybe 40 yards away, came a new sound. It was a wet, heavy, dragging noise. The sound of something immense pulling itself from the water and onto the land. Then, it started moving through the undergrowth toward the clearing. It wasn't the sound of walking. It was a slow, deliberate drag. Slosh. Drag. The noise of something heavy and wet being hauled over the forest floor. A foul stench. The smell of low tide, river mud, and something like rotting fish drifted to us. The dragging sound grew closer, moving methodically through the trees along the edge of the clearing. It passed our position, not 10 yards from where we hid. We were completely exposed. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my face into the damp bark of the fallen log, convinced that at any second, a long, spindly hand would close around the back of my neck. The dragging continued past us, circled the edge of the clearing, and then we heard it recede, ending with a final, deep splash as it re-entered the river. A moment later, the rhythmic splashing resumed, still keeping pace with the tree line, still moving upriver, still following us. We waited, not daring to breathe, until the sound was once again a steady presence to our left. Only then did Dad let out a slow, shaky breath and help me to my feet, pushing us back into the suffocating darkness of the forest. The forest held us in its cold, wet grip for the rest of the night. We kept moving, driven by the memory of the dragging sound and the foul smell that had filled the clearing. The splashing in the river remained our unseen companion, a tireless metronome marking our desperate pace. My body was a collection of aches and pains, my ankles screaming, my lungs burning, the sting of 100 small cuts on my hands and face. But the physical misery was nothing compared to the cold dread that had taken up permanent residence in my gut. Dawn arrived not as a sunrise, but as a slow dilution of the darkness. The fog thinned from an impenetrable wall to a gray, ghostly shroud, revealing the brutal landscape we had been fighting through. Towering spruce, tangled alder, and the ever-present thorny arms of Devil's Club. We staggered onto a game trail and saw a pile of fresh bear scat, filled with undigested berries. A year ago, a week ago, that sight would have sent a spike of fear through me. Now, the thought of a bear felt mundane, a known quantity, in a world that had suddenly shown us the truly unknown. Dad's military discipline was the only thing that kept us from collapsing. He rationed sips of water from my pack and checked his compass every 10 minutes, his movements stiff but unwavering. The 15 miles to the ranger patrol cabin he'd pointed out on the map before our trip might as well have been 100. It was late afternoon when we finally stumbled out of the tree line. My legs gave out and I fell to my knees, looking up at a sight I thought I'd only see again in my dreams. It was a small, solid log cabin with a green metal roof. A thin line of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a fragile gray ribbon against the immense backdrop of the mountains. We must have been a hell of a sight, collapsing on the steps of the porch. The door opened, and a man stood there. He was older, maybe late 50s, with a face that seemed carved from the same timber as the cabin, all seams and weathered lines. His eyes, though, were calm and sharp. He took in our torn clothes, our pale, scratched faces, and the raw terror that I knew was still plain in my expression. He didn't ask what happened. "Get inside, you two," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "You look like you've been through a ringer." He helped us into the single warm room, sat us down in wooden chairs, and wrapped thick wool blankets around our shoulders. He handed us steaming mugs of tea so sweet it made my teeth ache, but the warmth spread through my chest and into my frozen limbs. He moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency, never asking a single question until the shivering in my body had finally stopped. "Bill Haskins," he said, taking a seat across from us. "You two are a few days overdue." Dad, his voice hoarse and flat, started to talk. He recounted everything, leaving nothing out. He spoke with the precision of a man making an official report. The arrival, the first perfect day, the rhythmic tapping in the fog. He described the lure of bone and obsidian, his words measured and exact. He detailed the tall figure in the water, its impossible cast, the threat in its final stare. He told of the assault on the cabin, the escape, and the long, terrifying flight through the dark, paced by the sounds from the river. I just sat there, nodding, the hot mug trembling in my hands. When Dad finished, an absolute silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of wood in the stove. I expected Haskins to sigh, to look at us with pity, to start talking about hypothermia and the tricks exhaustion can play on the mind. Instead, he stared into his own mug for a long time. Then he got up, walked to a small cluttered bookshelf, and pulled down an old leather-bound book with a faded spine. He handled it carefully. "I've been on this river for 30 years, he said, his back to us. "You hear things, you see things you can't explain. Most you write off, but not all of them." He came back to the table and opened the book. On the yellowed page was a faded but detailed pencil sketch. It was a tall, gaunt figure with unnaturally long limbs, standing waist-deep in water. My breath caught in my throat. "The Dena'ina, the people who've lived here for thousands of years. They have stories," Haskins said, his finger tapping the drawing. "Stories about the Nantina, the riverman. They say he's not a ghost, but a spirit of the river itself. Old and territorial. He guards his best fishing spots. Doesn't like rivals." He looked up, his calm eyes meeting Dad's. "They say he can't be hurt, only avoided. You took fish from his water, and he saw it as a challenge. You were lucky. By leaving, you showed respect. That's probably the only reason you're here." The next day, Haskins made a call on his radio. "Found those 2 overdue anglers from the upper bend," he said into the handset. "Got turned around in the fog, suffering from exposure. I'm bringing them in." That was all. He protected our story, locking it away as something that belonged to the river, not to an official report. The boat ride downriver under a bright, clear sky was surreal. The water was the same brilliant turquoise, the spruce trees the same deep green. The world looked exactly as it had when we'd arrived, but it was all a lie. It was a mask. We knew what it hid when the fog came down. Later, on the float plane back to Anchorage, the drone of the engine was a loud, comforting sound from a world I understood. We hadn't spoken about it since leaving the ranger's cabin. We didn't need to. I looked over at my father. He wasn't just my dad anymore. He was the man who had smashed a window and led us through a monstrous darkness. He met my gaze, and I saw something new in his eyes too. Respect. An acknowledgement of what we had faced. In that silent, shared look, everything was said. We had gone to the edge of the map and fallen off. We had survived something ancient and unexplained. We had been lucky, and we both knew it. The bond between us was no longer just one of father and son. It was the unbreakable tie of two soul survivors.